We have been going through the book of Matthew, looking at Jesus and his interactions with his disciples. What was he teaching to them? What lessons was he instilling in them? What type of correction was he bringing to them? And then asking the question of how do those lessons apply to us today as his current disciples, as his current church here on this earth? We find ourselves in Matthew chapter 17. I'm reading from the English Standard Version. In verse 1, it reads, "And after 6 days, Jesus took with him Peter and James and John, his brother, and led them up on a high mountain by themselves. And he was transfigured before them. His face shone like the sun, and his clothes became white as light. And behold, there appeared to them Moses and Elijah talking with him. And Peter said to Jesus, 'Lord, it is good that we are here. If you wish, I will make 3 tents here, one for you and one for Moses and one for Elijah.' He was still speaking when, behold, a bright cloud overshadowed them, and a voice from the cloud said, 'This is my beloved Son, with whom I am well pleased. Listen to him.' When the disciples heard this, they fell on their faces and were terrified. But Jesus came and touched them, saying, 'Rise and have no fear.' And when they lifted up their eyes, they saw no one, but only Jesus. And as they were coming down the mountain, Jesus commanded them, 'Tell no one of the vision until the Son of Man is raised from the dead.' And the disciples asked him, 'Then why do the scribes say that first Elijah must come?' And he answered, 'Elijah does come, and he will restore all things. But I tell you that Elijah has already come.' And they did not recognize him, but did to him whatever they pleased. So also the Son of Man will certainly suffer at their hands." Then the disciples understood that he was speaking to them of John the Baptist. This is a really interesting story. And as we talked about in our last week's video from Matthew chapter 16, at the end there, verse 28, a lot of people hold to the idea that this is a fulfillment of what Christ had said right there. And I would agree with that. There's a lot we can learn from this story. There's a very important lesson. And I think we should almost just take it verse by verse, or the story as it goes. And so the story goes that he takes these 3 disciples away from the 12, and he climbs up this high mountain with them. They get to the top of the mountain, and Jesus is transfigured. What we mean by this is his heavenly state, he turns to that. So his clothing starts to glow as white as a light, and then his face shines like a light. And we have this 2 kind of reminders. We have a reminder going forward to the book of Revelation, where we have this picture of Jesus in the throne room in heaven, in this heavenly state that's just it's beautiful, and it's terrifying, and it's magnificent, and it's just, there's no one like him, and it highlights that fact. And then we also have this idea, looking back into the Old Testament, of Moses when he would climb up the mountain and meet with God. And when he came back down, it said that his face was shining like a bright light, that it terrified the Israelites, to the point where they actually made him a veil, so that when he would go up the mountain, he would come back down, he could cover his face with this veil until the shining went away, that he would then look like a normal man, and that they could respond with him. And so they see Jesus in this state. And then all of a sudden, Moses and Elijah appear there with Jesus. And he's talking to them, and the disciples are, they seem to be slightly removed from the conversation. And Peter pipes up, and he has this wonderful, bright idea. And he says, "Jesus, it's good that we're here. If you wish, I'll build a temple or a shelter for you and for Elijah and for Moses, so we don't have to leave this place." And it says that he's still talking. He's elaborating maybe on his plan here, or on this idea of how we can stay in this moment when this cloud of light, much like the cloud of light that would have guided the Israelites through the wilderness at nighttime, and the regular cloud during the day, this cloud of light comes over the mountain, and this booming voice cuts Peter off. And, it's sometimes annoying when you're talking and someone cuts you off, but when it's this booming voice of God, it shuts everything down. And they fall on their faces and they're terrified, and they hear the voice of God booming out of this cloud. This is my Son with whom I am well pleased. Listen to him. They're terrified. But there's an important message there in what God was saying. Listen to him. You see, I talked about in the last video when we were looking at the end of chapter 16, how it's almost as if the three disciples here that are with Christ, they get a sneak peek at the glory of God. They get to watch a preview, if you will, a sampling of the glory of God, Christ in his heavenly state before the rest of man gets to encounter that. And their natural response to this, and I get it, is, my goodness, let's not leave this place. Let's stay here. You can think about Moses when he would go up the mountain and spend extended periods of time with God. It's so much so that the Israelites, they just assumed, I guess he's not coming back, and they created this golden calf that they would worship. And there's this sense, and as we read the Bible, I hope you come to this conclusion too, as you read the Bible and you see the wonders of God and the greatness of God, and you read the end account in Revelation and heaven coming down on the new earth and us to be united with God and all of his glory and wonder and splendor and all this stuff, that there's this longing for that moment. There's this longing to be there and to not let go of that God, I just want to be with you. I love you. More than anything. And so, the response of, let's stay here. Let's not leave this moment. Let's not allow this to move on. Everything that seemed so important in that moment, the other commitments, the other 9 disciples down at the bottom of the mountain, the things that, they thought they were going to do in their life and all that stuff, that seems to fade away. And it's just this idea of, let's stay here. But God's voice cuts him off, terrifies them, throws them to the ground, and they're sheltering and they're scared as they hear this voice saying, this is my Son with whom I am well pleased. Listen to him. So often we can present our own ideas. So often we can come to God with our own plan and our own ideas and our own expectations and all this stuff. And there can be this response, and there should be this response that we understand of, listen to God. Listen to what he has to say. Submit to what his will is. Understand that he knows best. And although we might have desires, and the desire to be with God, the desire to stay in that moment or to fast forward to that moment, kind of like in Paul's writing where he talks about this deep desire to depart from this world so that he might be with God. And how wonderful that would be. That's not a wrong longing to have. But Paul's conclusion was, but it's better for me to stay that I might build up the church and do what God wants of me. And Jesus' response to Peter and these disciples is, we need to go down the mountain. There's other things that I need to do. And his response to us when we can get focused so much on the future is, hey, there's work to be done now. I have things for you to do now. I want you, yes, to glorify and worship and praise me then, but also now. There's people who I want to use you as my vessel to point them towards Christ, to help them understand the truth of the gospel and all these other things. And then Jesus comes and he touches them and he says, get up, don't be afraid. And they look up and all of a sudden the cloud of light's gone. Moses and Elijah is gone. Jesus' face is no longer shining and his clothes have gone back to the normal state. The moment has passed. It's no longer now, it was then. It's gone away and they have to move forward. It can be a difficult thing to do to move on from something like that, I imagine. But they had to. I don't know if you've ever climbed a mountain. In Nova Scotia, we don't really have mountains. We have some wonderful hills in Cape Breton, but not really a mountain. When I was in college in Alberta, we would often go to Banff or to Jasper, and we would climb a mountain. Nothing that you need to be like an expert mountain climber for, but we would get up high, right? We'd climb to the top of these mountains, And the hike was wonderful and hard and challenging and incredible. And if you weren't up for it, you could take the gondola. But regardless, you get to the top, this crazy high place, and it's awe-inspiring. You've never been able to see that far. And you just see, and you see the mountain ranges, and maybe you pick out an animal over here, an animal over there, and you see the river, this massive Russian river. It just looks like a line drawn through the sand, and you can see far, and it's cold, and the air is thinner, and all this stuff, and it's just awe-inspiring, and you don't want to leave that moment. There's something about it that's just, it's so cool. There's nothing like it. And I remember just soaking it in. It was freezing cold. One time we went down and we were up there, and I had my winter coat on and a toque, and you get to the bottom and then you take that all off and you're hot again. And it's there's nothing else like it. But there is this process of, as you're climbing down the mountain, and it's like, all right, I can no longer see past that ridge. I can no longer see over there. I can't even see the river anymore. And now I'm hot, and I got to shed some layers, and now I'm just back to the ground, and I'm back to normal living. They had to move on from that. Now they just have the memory of that moment. They're told not to share it with anyone until Christ has died and then rose again. And then they can open up and they can talk about it, and they can share the truth of that and how wonderful that experience was. And they can hold on to that and say, I'm looking forward to the day that comes again. And I would encourage you as a Christian to look forward to that day. To look forward to the moment where you get to stand before God and see Christ in all of His glory, and have your tears wiped away, and pain and suffering is no more. And you're just in the glory of God, and you're united with Him, and it's wonderful. And when I read about that account in the Bible, I long for it. But I also hear the booming voice of God saying, listen to my son. And I feel the sense of Christ climbing down the mountain with them, with the idea of there's work to be done. I still have to go and suffer. I have to die. I have to be rose again. And then He sends them out and all this other stuff. And so it's kind of a twofold application here. On the one side, you should long for that moment when you get to be with God in all of His glory and all of His splendor and wonder. You should long for that. And that should make everything else kind of fade into the background. That all of a sudden, those plans, those dreams that you had, or these things that once seemed of so much value to you, those now fade away to being, well, nothing next to that. But then also the idea of looking to the future, but being present in the now. So often we can get caught up in tomorrows that we forget that God actually wants to use us today. God wants us to glorify Him today in what we do. God has people that He wants you to point towards Him to today. He wants to be glorified and you to witness to others and all this wonderful stuff. And so it's twofold. Yes, long for that day, but like Paul, in your realization, say, it's better that I stay here until God brings me to that place, that I might serve His kingdom, that I might be a benefit to my brothers and sisters of the church. And as I often do, when I end these videos or if I end a sermon, I'll usually make the statement of glorifying God in all that you do. And I would encourage you to start every day kind of with that mindset of coming down the mountain and saying, God, how can I glorify you today? What can I do to serve your kingdom today? And keep that eternal perspective of looking forward to God in all of His glory, of being united with Him, redeemed and perfected, having every tear wiped away. I hope that's helpful to you today. And I hope, as I just said, that as you go about this week, that you would honor God in all that you do.